We've seen that, while the connection between poverty and later well-being is very complex, there's a growing body of evidence that suggests there may be some causal effect of poverty on later well-being. If that's the case, it's important to understand why that is. The question of whether the connection between poverty and well-being is a causal one is important if we want to design effective methods to reduce poverty and its ill effects. Recent research has produced evidence suggesting 3 major pathways through which this cause and effect relationship could operate. It could be that certain material resources matter in determining future well-being, and poverty simply deprives the poor of these key resources. It could also be that the experience of poverty and the associated scarcity of resources changes the nature of decision-making by the poor, and this leads to poor outcomes. Finally, recent science suggests that poverty may cause biological changes that can affect later outcomes or well-being. Let's start with the simplest explanation of how poverty or low income could cause poor health, poor education, or reduced well-being. The fact that the poor tend to have worse health could potentially be explained as a result of their lack of access to regular health care. If financial constraints mean that individuals go without adequate routine or preventive care, it may not be surprising that they eventually are in worse health. Here, the key question is whether there is strong evidence that a lack of preventive care leads to long-term reductions in health. Much of what we know about this question comes from studies of the Medicaid program, which provides medical care for low-income children and adults. The earliest studies of the Medicaid program looked at outcomes for children before and after some major expansions in how many children were eligible for Medicaid. The results of these studies suggested that when more children and more pregnant women were given access to Medicaid, there were both reductions in infant mortality and reductions in the frequency of low birth weight births. Because low birth weight is associated with many later health complications, these studies also found that the Medicaid program saved lives and reduced overall medical costs for the affected populations. These findings, however, may not be the final word. More recently, there have been studies of adult populations that are newly eligible for Medicaid. One such study that has received a great deal of attention is a study from the state of Oregon. As Oregon expanded eligibility for its Medicaid program, changes in their budget and the number of individuals signing up generated an opportunity to choose who received access to Medicaid from an oversubscribed enrollment list in a relatively random manner. This allowed for a convincing study of how access to Medicaid affected health outcomes, using those who did not gain access as a control group. In Oregon, as expected, the availability of Medicaid resulted in a doubling of preventive care use. This increase in preventive care, however, has so far not shown any reduction in mortality or improvements in a variety of clinical health indicators. There was evidence that access to medical care in this case led to improved mental health. As a result of the Affordable Care Act, many states have expanded Medicaid eligibility, and so we will likely continue to see new studies of how these expansions may affect long-term health. Overall, there is some evidence that more income used for healthcare resources can improve long-term health, but it is not conclusive. Another very direct way that resources can affect later life outcomes is through allowing access to improved nutrition. Here, as we mentioned earlier, there is evidence that availability of more resources through the food stamp program, for example, improves subsequent health, and this is likely the result of directly increasing nutrition resources. The next possible explanation for the connection between poverty and subsequent well-being is far less obvious or direct, but a growing body of evidence suggests that it may be quite important. The hypothesis here has largely been laid out in a book from 2013 by psychologist Eldar Sharif and the economist Sindel Mullainathan. These authors argue that poverty is a particular form of scarcity, and that such scarcity produces demands on mental capacity and energy. This means that the poor may make suboptimal decisions which can ultimately perpetuate their poverty. There are a number of ways this effect can operate, as illustrated here. The key insight is that scarcity can produce many mental challenges. How will I pay bills this month? Will I find a higher-paying job? Who will take care of my children while I work? And human cognitive capacity is necessarily limited. Thus, the more an individual is focusing on the challenges and stresses of poverty or scarcity, the less well considered will be other important life decisions. It's not uncommon for observers to note that the poor sometimes make what appear to be bad or suboptimal decisions which may seem to an outsider to not be in the individual's own best interest. For example, it's known that parenting styles of the poor differ from those of higher income individuals. Poor mothers, on average, have been found to be less responsive to their children and may respond in more punitive ways when they do interact. This may lead children to develop in less positive or constructive ways, be less comfortable or successful in school, and so could play a role in perpetuating poverty across generations. Another example is that the poor are known to receive less preventive health care and follow through with less follow-up care, even when they do have health insurance coverage through Medicaid. This could affect their productivity at work and so again lead to continued poverty. Finally, many point to the seeming irrationality of the poor taking out high-interest or payday loans that may make it impossible for them to get ahead due to the very high interest charges that accrue. What theories of the cognitive or decision-making effects of scarcity tell us is that such supposedly bad decisions may simply be the result of the stress of poverty and scarcity. If poverty itself plays a role in causing these decisions, it may become a self-perpetuating state. If this is the case, providing resources or assistance that lessen the scarcity of income or time for the poor has the potential to break the cycle of poverty. Much of the evidence here comes from laboratory or similar experiments. In one case, researchers asked both rich and poor subjects to complete some simple cognitive challenges, like quizzes or puzzles. Some of the test subjects, prior to completing these challenges, were told to imagine that they were facing an unexpected auto repair that could cost as much as $1,500. Among the poor who completed the task after receiving a suggestion of this negative economic news, performance on the cognitive challenges was worse. The rich showed no similar impact on performance. This suggests that concerns about financial challenges among those facing scarce income, even hypothetical concerns, may interfere with the ability to think through a situation and reason. This is just one bit of evidence that the effect of poverty on cognitive functioning and decision-making may be one important reason why reducing poverty could improve long-run outcomes. Finally, a third set of explanations for a potential causal effect of poverty on later outcomes is that poverty may cause actual biological changes in individuals. Poverty and the associated stress may affect brain development, functioning, and structures, as well as production and regulation of stress hormones. We know that the brain structures of poor individuals seem to be systematically different from those of high-income individuals, based on new techniques using MRIs to measure brain structures. In particular, there is evidence that areas of the brain relating to memory and what is known as executive function, including self-control and the ability to defer gratification, may be different among those experiencing chronic poverty. The critical question is whether poverty has caused these differences in brain structures, because we know that other sources of stress, including stress-related illnesses, can result in similar changes to brain structures. Scientists believe these changes may well be the result of chronic poverty. This is a rapidly expanding area of research, but a clear way in which poverty might change individual biology in important ways. Another set of biological effects of poverty, potentially related to those effects on the brain, is that poverty and the often chaotic environment associated with poverty can alter the level and timing of stress hormone production and regulation. Particularly for young children raised in chronic poverty, the home environment may be a source of frequent perceived threats and responses. This may be the result of parental stress, mobility across different housing locations, family disruptions, or other situations known to be especially common among the poor. One concern is that if young children's nervous systems develop in an environment in which they are frequently exposed to these threatening situations, this may lead to a situation in which they are constantly on alert and ready to react to these outside distractions. While this can be a healthy mechanism to develop for those exposed to frequent threats, it may not be conducive to concentration and focus in a classroom setting, for example, in which such threats are diminished. This process may also have other negative biological consequences. The term allostatic load refers to the wear and tear on the body thought to occur as the result of frequent activation of stress responses. It's likely that chronic poverty increases allostatic load, and this has been linked to immune system and certain disease risks. If poverty causes problems later in life, it's important to understand exactly why that is. There are three main explanations, and all of them now have some support from research. Poverty may simply reduce resource availability and so reduce potentially important investments in future health, education, or other human capital. Poverty may also be thought of as a version of scarcity that can reduce the effectiveness of decision-making. Finally, more and more science is showing that poverty and stress can result in biological changes that may set up individuals for bad outcomes in a variety of ways in the future.